Okay, I'm going to be brief here because I really want to hear your questions and comments on the presentations. But I want to start by revisiting some points that Andy and Dean Wani made. And the first one is I'm grateful to Dean Wani for the emphasis on rule of law and sort of the subsidiary emphasis on justice sector as the critical underpinning of SSR, and I agree with that completely, and I think the lessons from the continent are illustrating that in spades. Rule of law is the foundation. Without that foundation, it's very, very difficult to make any of the SSR components work the way they're supposed to. That said, the unfortunate fact, and I'm a practitioner, and like Andy, these are just my opinions, so take them for what they're worth. They certainly don't reflect the position of the United States government. One of the real problems is that if you look at all the different components of security sector reform in Africa, and let me say up front, if you're looking for innovative ideas, if you're looking for new strategies, if you're looking for really promising approaches, look in Africa and look at African security sectors. Look at you and your colleagues. That's where the best new ideas are coming from in the community of practice. One of the challenges is that in all of the elements of SSR, the least well-resourced, least effective, most problematic on the continent is justice and rule of law. And one of the features of this is look around. How many justice actors are in the room? And we have the same problem on the United States side. We, all of us as security sector professionals, need to recognize the importance of our justice and rule of law partners. And so one of the real challenges for security sector reform as a practice is sort of addressing the deficit. If you look at where the focus has been, where the most effective efforts of reform has been, kind of up at the top you got defense and military. In the middle you got kind of police and law enforcement and some of the oversight stuff, ministerial, legislature, and then at the bottom you got justice processes, rule of law, judiciaries. And I agree completely with Dean Wani that rule of law underpins everything else. And then I want to go to what I think is a related issue, one of the first points that Andy made. Leadership matters. If you're looking for what enables security sector reform, and all the discussions we've had about political will comes from leadership. Matt Hung-Nipo and I went to Cote d'Ivoire in the spring of 2012 because we were invited by the new government of Cote d'Ivoire to come and run a seminar on security sector reform. And I'll tell you, it was for Matt and I, it was a disappointing experience. It was discouraging. The problems Cote d'Ivoire was confronting were deep. The divisions were deep. The grievances were real. There have been a lot of lives lost. And it just did not look to us like the political will from the top was going to be there. And we kind of both talked about it and thought, maybe in Cote d'Ivoire it's got to work from the ground up instead of the top down. In talking to Matt, one of the most encouraging conversations I've had in the last several months was talking to Matt yesterday. He is now the permanent security sector reform advisor in Cote d'Ivoire to the security sector reform program there, the Ivorians. And one of the things he said is the difference is political will and leadership. The president is personally vested in the process. He's made clear to his government that he's vested in the process and that he expects them to support it. Leadership matters. In SSR, it matters most. So that's probably, now, so what does that mean to us? Because we're practitioners, right? We're not presidents. We're not we're not the chairman of the Defense and Security Committee in Parliament, although there are a few parliamentarians here. It seems to me that what it means to us is we need to figure out what our role is in helping to advise and build political will for necessary reform amongst our leaders. That's who we answer to. And one of the things that I hope you will talk about the rest of the week is how you, and you all are senior members of your security sector now. Many of you are going to advance to the top positions as chiefs of defense forces, inspector generals of police, at the most senior levels of your country's security sector. How do you as professionals find ways to help your political leadership build political will. That is one of the most important points I think that we can talk about. Very quickly, I just want to talk about what I see as some emerging lessons from Africa that I think are important to the developing practice of security sector reform. And the first is this connection between peace operations and transitional security sector reform. In other words, the recognition that security sector reform is ultimately one of the critical ways you get out of conflict. And if your peacekeeping force, like AMISOM or ECOMOG or MONUSCO, is the principal player in the security sector, then that mission has got to become involved in SSR, and it's got to figure out how to do that effectively. Listening to senior African commanders coming out of AMISOM over the past year, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is, look, the blood of our soldiers has created the opportunity for getting out of this mess. But we need reform, we need governance, we need the Somalis to build governance, to build security institutions, to build processes. Who's doing that? In the case of AMISOM, the answer is not really anybody. Now, the UN has gotten heavily involved in security sector reform, but what I hear from my African counterparts is the African Union, the African partners, have to take ownership of this. That is one of the most encouraging messages I have ever heard. And one of the reasons is, and I know I may offend Dean Wani, but I'm going to say it anyway. The UN does not understand how to do security sector reform in Africa. Africans understand how to do security sector reform in Africa. And the African partners have to take ownership of that process. And I think we're going to see that in AMISOM. There is a movement afoot in the AU and in the regional economic communities to genuinely invest resources in those sort of soft elements of security sector reform, not just keeping order on the streets, but helping Somalia, to the federal government, to build institutions, to build capability, to build governance. That's absolutely critical. Second point here, increasing focus on rule of law, justice, and policing. And this is so welcome. Part of it's the movement towards human security, but it's most pronounced in Africa, sort of waking up and saying, look, it's the police, guys. That's who the people deal with, not the military. And ultimately, it's also the justice sector, because if the police arrest the guy and they know that they're going to take him to the local magistrate is either going to take a payoff and let him go, or is going to be so scared of his clan that he's afraid to hold him guilty. What's the policeman going to do? Whatever the policeman does, it's not going to be good. So this is the one of the most encouraging aspects of security sector reform on the continent. And you're starting to see emphasis on police reform all over Africa. It is a learning process, and it's a challenge. We collectively, as a community of practice, we understand military reform and defense reform. We really do. We know how to do it. We do not understand police reform, and we're not very good at it, collectively. We're even less good at justice reform. Okay, consensus on the need for effective separation of powers. And Andy's absolutely right. We assume that everybody buys into this. Here's my observation. What I see around the continent is a growing realization that separation of powers is a necessary concept for governance and security in Africa. Maybe the parliament works in London. It is not going to work on the continent. The checks and balances that come with effective separation of powers are absolutely essential. And that's what I see. And one of the things that I see is the growing role of legislatures in the security process. The growing involvement of legislatures as a branch of government. That's really valuable to you and me for a couple of reasons. One reason is because the legislatures can bring opposition parties to the table. That matters to us. Politically, winner-take-all politics is one of the biggest problems we have. It's a problem in the United States, too. Typically, the executive branch, and that's all the security guys, they're controlled by one party. So in a very real sense, if I'm an opposition party, I don't have much ownership of the security sector. When you work with Parliament, you give those opposition parties and the people they represent a stake in what we do. Now, for the legislature to be effective in providing oversight and in writing laws, we as security professionals have to help them because we're where the technical expertise resides. We provide that technical expertise to the executive branch routinely, to the Minister of Defense, to the President, to the Prime Minister. We equally need to provide that technical expertise to the legislature if we want the legislature to be an effective partner. Nonpartisan security services. You know, the best story, there are two great stories here, one at the top and one at the bottom. Here's the story from the top. A retired chief of defense forces in Africa, I'm not going to name the country, very senior guy, professional, war college attendee, commanded his military services, understands civilian control of the military, is a thorough professional in every way. Gets appointed to be the chief of his country's intelligence services, okay? Intelligence services that are notorious for interfering in the political process, for beating up the political opposition, for doing everything necessary to keep the guy at the top in charge. So the new president calls the new chief of the intelligence services in. And the new president says, look, I want to know what the political opposition is saying. I want you to go out there and bug those opposition leaders. I want your agents out there at those opposition rallies. And the new chief of the intelligence service says, I can't do that. That's not the job of the intelligence service. It's not the job of the intelligence service to interfere in politics. It's the job of the intelligence service to report on threats to national security. That is a true story. That actually happened. Guy eventually lost his job, but the point is, there is the role of a professional, apolitical, nonpartisan senior leader in the security sector. That is becoming the norm in Africa. And it's kind of what we call, say in American English, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That guy, by what he said to the president, fundamentally changed the debate in his country and fundamentally changed how the system looked at itself. The other example, Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone political elections and the program to educate their police in their communities about the appropriate role security services are supposed to play when there is an election. Changing a model of abuse and political interference to a model of professionalism, nonpartisanship. And on that note, I will conclude my remarks, and I look forward to your questions.